Factoring trinomials. Now trinomials are the nice ones if they're in the easy form. We'll go through a bunch of problems when they are in the easy form of x squared plus bx plus c versus the not so easy form, which has a number in front of your x squared. Now this kind, the easy form, you really want to think back to how we FOILed previously. So last week when we FOILed, we had something like x plus 2 times x plus 3. This is our review of FOIL. And in order to simplify that, you took your first term and you distributed it through verse outside. Gave us x squared plus 3x. Then the inside and the last plus 2x plus 6, separating all of our terms nicely with our plus signs. And then we noticed that the middle terms, the oi of FOIL, were like terms. And so we then combined them and said, 3x plus a 2x would give me 5x. Plus 6 comes along, the x squared comes along. So what's happening this week is we're starting with the x squared plus 5x plus 6, and we want to rewrite it as this product of x plus 2 and x plus 3. Remember, in math land, it's all about learning how to go forward and then learning how to go back and undo what you just did. It's all about going forward and going backwards. So we're just going to start with this one. Now, if you think back to how we simplified things last week with the FOIL method, the first x times x gave us that x squared, and there were never any like terms with that x squared. That just comes along. And similarly, the last was a number times a number, which always gave you this plain old number or constant at the end, and that didn't have any like terms. So that just came along for the ride. It was the combination of the outside and the inside that made this middle term. And that outside and the inside came from taking the x times the 3, the factor with your 6, and the 2 in the x, the other factor of your 6. So working this backwards, thinking about working this backwards, we're starting with a trinomial this week, and we want to write it as a product of binomials. Now once again, we never had any like terms with the x squared, so the first terms here and here of your binomials will multiply to get you x squared. So we'll always go back to x times x. The last two numbers in your binomials multiply to your 6. So we need two numbers that multiply to 6. But at the same time, when we combine them, remember, they had to add to 5. So we're looking for two numbers that multiply to 6 and add to 5. Now we would say, hey, 3 and 2, and they both have to be positive. Doesn't matter which one you put first, the 3 or the 2. So that's not so bad. Let's see if that works on another. Here's another problem, x squared minus 12x plus 20. Once again, when factoring, the first thing I always look for is a greatest common factor. There isn't one that goes into all three of these terms, and so we go on to our next step. The next step says count how many terms you have. I have 1, 2, 3 terms, so this is a trinomial. Fortunately, it's also the easy kind of trinomial because the number in front of x squared is a 1. So that means I break it apart here to my two sets of parentheses. And I say, okay, the first one's got to multiply to x squared. So the first is always going to be x times x. Now I need two numbers that multiply to 20, but they need to add to a negative 12. This is a little different from our last one. Here we need two numbers that multiply to a positive but add to a negative. Well, this is when I go to my signs and I say, what do I know about signs? Okay. If this sign is positive, okay, that tells me that both of my signs in the binomials have to be the same. because the only way to get a positive 20 is a positive number times a positive number, or a negative number times a negative number. So I know that both signs are going to be the same. Now, are they both going to be positive or are they both going to be negative? That's when I look to the number or the sign in front of my bx term. That's called the linear term. The sign in front of my 12 is negative, indicating that I need this to be a negative 12. Well, a positive number plus a positive number is not going to add to a negative number. Only a negative plus a negative makes it more negative. So this tells me that they're both going to be the same. This tells me that they're both going to be negative in my parentheses. Now, what numbers are going to go in there? We once again are looking for factors of 20, so two numbers that multiply to 20 that add to 12. Well, sometimes it's easier if we list all of our factors of 20. That's why we learned about factorizations. Let's see, 1 times 20 is 20, 2 times 10, and 4 times 5. Those are my only options for 20. Now, which combination adds up to a 12? We don't have to worry about the negative 12 in this case because the negative signs we've already placed in there that took care of that. And we see right down here that 2 and 10 make 20. Once again, because both signs in here are the same, it doesn't matter which number I put first and which number I put second. Now, make sure that you have the answer correct by foiling. Technically, in your FOIL method, you don't need to do the first and the last. I chose x times x to get me x squared. I chose negative 2 times a negative 10 to give me a positive 20. I just need to check that my outside and my insides combine to give me the negative 12. My outside here is a negative 10x. My inside here is a negative 2x. Negative 2 and a negative 10 is negative 12. So it checks. This is my answer in factored form. X, the quantity of x minus 2 times the quantity of x minus 10. Here's another example. Now it looks fairly similar to the first one that we did, that was x squared plus 5x plus 6. But we've switched both of our signs. Now I have to see how that's going to change our end result. Once again, there's no greatest common factor, so I go to my two sets of parentheses. Only way to get my x squared is x times x. Now in this case though, we have a couple other changes. I notice here that my sign in front of my 6 is negative. The only way that we multiply two numbers together and get a negative is if one is positive and one is negative. So when I put my numbers in, I'm going to have a positive and a negative. That means, though, that when I do my outside and my insides, I'll have one number that's negative and one that's positive. When I'm adding terms with opposite signs, we really subtract them. So in this case, I'm looking for two numbers that'll multiply to 6, but subtract and get me negative 5. Ooh, two numbers that multiply to negative 6, but subtract to give me my negative 5. Well, if I use 2 and 3, one of those would be negative and one of them would be positive. That would either give me a 1x or a negative 1x. That's not negative 5. So in this case, I'm not going to be using 3 and 2. Instead, we're going to be using our 1 and 6. The other option to get 6 is always 1 in itself. Now I need because it's subtracting to a negative 5, the larger number needs to be negative. So I'm going to put the 6 over here and the 1 here. And as always, I'm going to FOIL to check to make sure that I got it right. I don't have to check the entire FOIL method. Once again, I chose x times x to get me x squared. I chose a positive 1 times a negative 6 to give me a negative 6. I just need to check my outsides and my inside. 1 minus 6 is negative 5x. That's what I have here, so it checks. So because this was a minus up here, I knew I needed one of each sign. Because it was negative here, my bigger number needed to be negative. And then I was really subtracting. It was a 6 minus 1 to get me a 5. With the 6 being larger, it stayed a negative 5. Be careful with your signs. So for the easy form of a trinomial, when we have x squared plus bx plus c, the key is to find two numbers that multiply to c and add to b. So you're going to ask yourself, what two numbers multiply to c and add to b? And as always, watch your signs. If c is positive, then both signs will match what b is. Let me say that one more time. If c, the constant at the end, is positive, then both signs in your parentheses will follow b. b is negative, so in this case, they're both negative. Then you're always looking for two numbers that multiply to 16 and add to 10. 16 is 8 times 2, and 8 plus 2 is 10. If the sign on your C is negative, that tells us that in our parentheses, we're going to have one of each sign. One's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. And we have to be careful as to which number we put where, because that will change our answer. In this case, I need two numbers that multiply to 20 and add, or because we'll have one of each sign, subtract to 1. Remember, there's always a 1 in front of any variable if there's no number written. I know that 5 and 4, my 5 is positive and my 4 is negative. 5x minus 4x is 1x, which is what I was looking for. So if I have a negative here, I have one of each sign, but be careful where you put your signs to get your final answer. That is factoring trinomials, which are in the easy mode. My next little video will be trinomials that have a number in front of x squared. That's going to be a little bit more difficult.